COVID-19 is a devastating example of a crisis which ripples through regions and countries, affecting all aspects of our lives. The impacts of the pandemic have hit some communities harder than others, especially in the global south. Fortunately, we're seeing signs of resilience emerging from many affected communities. There's ongoing mobilization to combat the direct and indirect impacts of the pandemic. And this could be crucial when navigating this exceptional situation we're in. My name is Albert Norström, and with me today I have Rafael Calderon-Contreras from the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico and Cibele Queiroz from the Global Resilience Partnership and Stockholm Resilience Centre. Together, we'll take a closer look at some of these communities and how they have responded to this crisis. What can we learn from them? And how can we build social resilience for similar events in the future? Welcome to Rethink Talks. Welcome to Rethink Talks. Welcome Rafa, early morning in Mexico City. And welcome Cibele here in the studio in Stockholm. Before we get started, it'd be great just to get a quick introduction of yourselves. And maybe we can start with you, Cibele.
Yes, so my name is Cibele Queiroz, and I'm a researcher at the Global Resilience Partnership and the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And the main focus of my work is basically to try to understand how can we improve the resilience of food production landscapes and the livelihoods of the people that live in those landscapes to sort of shocks and surprises. And currently my main focus is on sort of regions that are very vulnerable or fragile.
And how about you, Rafa?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to me to talk to you about these issues of resilience. I'm Rafael Calderon-Contreras, and I'm based in Mexico City. I'm a professor at the Social Science Department of the Autonomous Metropolitan University. And my main focus of research is social ecological systems with a predominance of urban systems and the nexus between ecosystem services, transformation, and the way in which we can build a more vibrant, resilient future for cities and, in general, social ecological systems.
We're going to be talking a lot about resilience in this episode, right? So maybe we can start by taking it from the basics and give our audience a bit of a primer, a definition of resilience, a simple definition. And Rafa, what does resilience mean to you?
Well, resilience comes from the understanding of complexity, really. So the idea of using resilience as a theoretical backbone is to understand how systems behave and how they react to certain changes. So for me, social ecological resilience is the ability of social ecological systems to withstand changes and maintain their main traits of identity and feedbacks. Maybe the most important thing about the concept itself, and that is more relevant for social resilience, is the idea of how these systems react to changes, basically that's the idea of resilience that I use in my research.
And Cibele, how would you define resilience based on your research and your experience?
Yeah, I think like a simple way of putting it is like I like to think on this metaphor of a boat that is facing a storm, right? You can be in a big cruise boat and you have this sort of false idea of stability. When the storm comes, you cannot avoid it. That's exactly how it is. The disturbances come and we cannot sort of avoid them or strike them forever. So in the end, you actually have to navigate the storm. And I would say that resilience is that capacity, is that adaptive capacity to navigate a storm without losing your identity. You don't want to lose your boat. But importantly, I think it's just that, where you end at the end of your journey or at the end of the storm, it's a different point from the point where you started. And that's exactly the same thing with resilience or with the crisis. You go through a crisis and you end up being, something slightly different. You can still have your identity as a system, as a community, but there was change. So I think that's how I would define it.
Thanks. So the term resilience, right, it has its roots in ecology, and it's come to be used in much broader systems, economic systems, social systems. We talk about social ecological systems. Rafa mentioned that in his definition. And you have different sources of resilience, right? So from the ecological component, a source of resilience would be biodiversity, for example. If we think about sources of social resilience, could we give some examples of that? Cibele.
Yes. So I think, again, like social resilience is a combination of sort of, you can say that it's a combination of the degree of exposure, how much you are exposed to a particular disturbance. So like if you live in an area that, it's very affected by climate change, you're very exposed, right? And then your adaptive capacity. So your capacity of sort of adapting to the changing circumstances. And that adaptive capacity, you can have different sources for it. And like some of the main sources of social resilience are like sort of, collaborations. So like you have collaborations with different actors in your networks. So you're well connected. Diversity in terms of like diversity of skills, or diversity of networks or diversity of knowledge types. So that's the kind of things that you need for social resilience. There are many, many elements, but I mean, these two are quite critical, I would say. And then also being aware that institutions play a very important role on social diversity. Because once you go from individual to collective, institutions are playing this mediating role of providing, skills, assets, financial flexibility, so sort of all like the sort of supporting structures that can sort of confine resilience to a society.
Thanks, Cibele. And Rafa, anything to add when it comes to the sources of social resilience?
Yeah, to me, maybe the main source of social resilience is self-organization. So you see it every day in local communities, the way in which they self-organize to face change, and the way in which this self-organization is a trait that in turns provides action, like common action for acting in the face of change. There have been a lot of discussion about the components of social ecological resilience. To me, there are three musketeers of these components, which is connectivity, something that Cibele has touched on her comment, connectivity, diversity, and feedbacks. So these are the three main, let's say, building blocks of social ecological resilience. But maybe the main characteristic, the main trait of resilience itself is the ability of self-organize. Self-organization is basic for every resilient component.
Okay, thanks. So let's go to the pandemic, which is crippling big parts of the world. It's had major disruptions globally. But the pandemic has hit especially hard in local communities, especially in the global south. Any reflections, any examples of that? Rafa, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, the pandemic is one in a generation, I would say opportunity even to think about the way in which we relate to nature. And we're looking at it in many different countries in the global south. There have been a lot of distress about the patterns of self-organization in local communities that are modified by this pandemic. Certainly, one of the things that are making it worse, at least in the case of Mexico and other Latin American countries, is the characteristics of inequality, social inequality and poverty are even making worse the way in which people are facing this pandemic. Taking specifically the case of Mexico, there's a strong correlation in between having or being more vulnerable to the pandemic, more at risk of getting the virus, if you are in a precarious situation in terms of your source of job or even your social economical status. So I would say that this event, even though it's a horrendous crisis that we're facing at a global scale is actually modifying the way in which local communities are organizing themselves to carry on with their normal lives. And I would say that the most important bit of this is that the situation in which local communities are is absolutely primer for understanding the way in which we are facing this situation in different contexts.
Oh, thanks, Rafa. Cibele, any reflection on this? I mean, based on the work you're doing with the Global Resilience Partnership, for example, what are some of the trends we're seeing in how local communities are being hit directly and indirectly by the pandemic?
Yeah, so I guess that mainly in these more vulnerable communities, there are sort of extra challenges. I mean, it's a challenge for all of us, but there are the press there is totally different, right? And I think it's at several levels. I mean, even at the health level, so sort of beyond just like the risk of getting sick, it's also that preventing the disease is far much harder. People live like in tight spaces with high density of people in small spaces, basically so crowded. Social distancing gets like very difficult. You have many communities without access to water. They cannot have like routines of hand washing. You have like a lot of misinformation and also disinformation. So there are like a bunch of like sort of extra challenges. Then exactly as Rafa mentioned, also like the fact that, well, in these parts of the world, most people depend on this kind of casual income, so like on a daily basis. And when you have measures like lockdowns, and then you basically lose your sources of income. So like there were some stories collected from some of GRP partners from the front lines of the COVID-19, which were really interesting from local communities. And in one of the cases in the Democratic Republic of Ghana, for instance, they did a survey to households in a city, and the results of the survey were saying that about 98% of the households didn't had enough food just before the lockdown. So that means that if you don't die of the COVID-19, you can actually die of hunger. So it's like, and that's exactly what the big numbers are showing, right? So right now we have almost we have like that by the end of 2020, we can have extra 130 million of people that become food insecure. And this is, this is of course like very, very dramatic. So we are talking, there are many research colleagues that are starting to talk about a new pandemic, like a hunger pandemic that will follow the COVID-19 pandemic. And also like just to end, so like, it's also important to think about that, in many of these areas where institutions are weak, so you don't have like the same state support, that you have in richer parts of the world. You don't have the same sort of social structures that can support you if you get without a job temporarily, or you need to stay home for 2 weeks, or, social contact is really important. So like, that's how people cope with crisis, right? Communities go together and collaborate. And right now, it's a paradox because at the same time, because of the risk of contagious, you should actually keep social distance. So that's really extra challenge also to those local communities. We could certainly like talk much more about many other things, but I think these are at least some crucial things.
It's interesting, Cibele, because you mentioned here already, and I see Rafa is nodding there. I mean, already that some sources of resilience are being eroded, but some sources of resilience are being mobilized at this time. And in Mexico and in Latin America, Rafa, are you seeing signs of social resilience being mobilized in the face of COVID-19 pandemic?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this question is quite relevant to after Cibele's comments on how different social conditions are affecting the pandemic. Take the case of Mexico, in which we have over 55% of our jobs in the informal sector. So that 56% of the population doesn't have the chance of staying at home and locking down, right? So the array of strategies to facing this pandemic have to increase. So what we're looking at in Mexico is that many places are actually changing the way in which we are, for instance, producing and consuming food, right? People are getting more sensitive about the need for improving or improving the way in which we produce food. That'll be one thing. Or another one is the way in which we move in the city, right? Mexico City has seen a decrease in the amount of traffic jams that has never happened before in the history of the city. Many countries in Latin America are building cities thinking about the car as the main objective rather than the people. And what we're looking at now with the pandemic is that even the way in which we build cities is going to change. So that's what I said, this has to be taken as an opportunity, especially for Latin American countries, to think about the way in which we are following development paths towards a more sustainable future.
And how about you, Cibele? Have you heard of interesting instances where sources of resilience are illuminating themselves in light of how the pandemic is hitting in these local communities in the global south? Yeah,
so I go back again to this project that I started to tell about this, because I really think it's an interesting project. You have been working with it, Albert, also these stories from the front lines that are being driven by ICAD in collaboration with the Global Resilience Partnership and other partners. And it's there's several examples there, right? Like there's several examples of how, for instance, like in India, there have been like community action groups that are led by women sort of started to see the very negative effects of the pandemic and how they were affecting like vulnerable groups in their community. And they suddenly spot that one group that was being like totally marginalized, right, was a group were like groups of like rural migrants that have come to work in the city. And then the lockdown happened and they lost their job. They didn't have any place to live and they couldn't get back home, right? And these women were like, they were actually able to started to have, contact with sort of decision makers at other scales and starting first to distribute food just by themselves, and then once sort of the government find a place for these people to be, they also realized that, okay, they had a place to sleep, but they didn't have enough information. They didn't know they had to do washing hands. So sort of like there's all this sort of mobilization of people that are actually helping with knowledge translation, with sort of providing food security to marginal groups. There were also like many examples from sort of how youth has been mobilizing, like in several societies, like with quite innovative ideas, how like small youth companies have suddenly been sort of forced to become more digital, right? In Nepal, for example, there were many examples like that they suddenly used support fundings, the few support fundings they had from the government, they used to buy mobile phones and to educate sort of their company members or their organization members. And that actually led to a shift, right? So they actually step up. They were in the digitalization process, which might have a good effect in the future, right? So there were like several examples like that, and how people were very fast able to self-organize. Like you said, Raf, I totally agree. I think self-organization is a key property of social resilience, and to self-organize very quickly and find sort of alternative solutions to things that were really locked, right? So.
Maybe even getting back to this idea of self-organization, I would say that this might be a case in which having less resources forces you to find social solutions to this problem. So in many Latin American countries where there's a lack of income or a lack of technology, the social responses are primed to as an alternatives to face the pandemic. For instance, local organizations of marketing and also producing as well. Even the distribution of education in different countries in Latin America has been, let's say, segregated in smaller groups, so they would avoid being contagious or getting the virus. So I would say that social responses are actually getting or proving better results than looking at technology or increasing a certain amount of money or resources to face the pandemic.
That's interesting. I mean, you're both talking a bit now about shifts happening, right? And in general, to simplify things, there's two kind of opposing views of how a crisis can affect a system, a society. Either the crisis just locks the system down in poverty or make things worse, or it provides a sort of window of opportunity to open up for something better, a better future. Do you think we're seeing signals of that? I know it's not perhaps a time to talk about this being an opportunity, but in some ways, maybe you can just tell us about if we're seeing signals of possible positive futures emerging from COVID-19. And I'll start with you, Cibele.
Yeah. So I guess that's, Albert, I think that in any crisis, those two things probably happen at the same time, right? So you have like, you have like these massive disruptive effects of the COVID-19 crisis, both in terms of that it's taking lives away and prematurely, and also that all the social consequences, like all the spill out over other society sectors, that's becoming this big like system crisis. So I think they both co-occur, and we should acknowledge that, right? There's no right and wrong here. It's like, but at the same time that this happens, exactly as in a personal crisis, right? When you go through a personal crisis, it's also an opportunity for you to reflect, to reflect, to see what could I have done different. It's also something that shakes a little bit the state of where you are and gives you an opportunity to rethink. And I think, yes, we are seeing signs of that. I think, for instance, like the fact that people have been forced to have social distancing. They have been sort of, for instance, it has sort of triggered a need for people to being closer to nature, for instance. That's why people are kind of, even people that are not food insecure, they are many of them cultivating food in their backyard, or they are going out on nature much often than they did. I think this is kind of a sign of a potential shift, sort of different ways of reconnecting with nature, for instance. Then there's like, other shifts, a bit like the examples that Rafa was saying, like different social innovations. A little bit the examples I said from Nepal, also this thing like with increased digitalization, like the need of going remotely has also done something, right? To every part of the world, but also a lot of countries in the global south probably experiencing a lot of changes in that matter. And I don't know, Rafa, if you probably have other.
Oh, yes. Something that is certain for me is that we are going to get out of this pandemic with a lot of biofears, right? And we're looking at them right now. For instance, local communities in Mexico and everywhere in Latin America fearing the presence of bats because they were the main transmitters of the virus and so on. And people often even kill large communities of bats because of this fear. And so that might be like the darkest side of the pandemic. But on the other hand, and following the work of Per Olsen and Karen O'Brien and others, even the work we are doing at the IPES platform about transformative change, there are three spheres of transformation. And the most difficult one to change is the personal sphere, the way in which we think about our relation with nature. And the pandemic is certainly changing the personal views of people on how we relate to nature. Let's say the easiest sphere of transformation is the technological one. So this idea of making or building up robustness in systems was mainly based on the idea that technology was going to change the way we relate to nature. And now we're looking at social resilience as a source of changing this relation we have with nature. So in a way, I see a positive pathway towards a more sustainable future given this pandemic, right? And given also the conscience that we are going to have another pandemic if we don't change the way in which we relate with nature, right? And I think this message is permeated across the whole spectrum of social strata, right? And we're looking at it at the way in which local communities are actually changing their attitudes towards nature itself.
Okay, so if you look in our crystal balls in the future, it's a complicated question, but I hope to get a quick answer from you both. How do we build resilience in the future for these local communities to have resilience, not only against pandemics, but against all types of big systemic risks that might be emerging in the future more and more often? I'll start with you, Cibele.
No, that's a really big question. Yeah, so, okay. So I guess that one of the things, and I think that's a lesson from the COVID-19 also, it's like, okay, this is a global crisis, okay? We had one single global threat. And in many places, the responses were actually quite similar. Like many countries, for instance, did lockdowns, okay? And that was, it was a kind of one-fits-it-all response. And I would argue that we need different types of strategies. So, yes, it was a single global crisis, but we have very many different contexts. And what we're seeing now is actually the negative effects from applying the same type of responses in these very different contexts, because they have different realities. So we need what we call as resilience researchers, response diversity. So sort of, a diversity we need more diversity on the way we respond to crisis, and that is adapted to the context. So that's one thing. The other thing, and that I think it happened actually, and it is happening during the COVID-19 crisis. And I think we start to see more collaboration between the grassroots communities that have been fairly isolated, that now start to reach out to decision makers. And they are also sort of eager to hear them, because they are the ones that actually sort of know what's happening in the front lines. And I think we need more of these collaborations, right? Better connection between sort of actors at different scales, a much better recognition of the role of this sort of grassroots communities. I mean, it's coming up evidence that in places where this sort of more organized grassroots groups don't exist, the effects of the pandemics have been far worse. Okay, that's even in vulnerable areas where these groups existed, there were still ways of adapting. So I think those two things. Do I have time to say a final one? No, Rafa?
We can jump off to Rafa,
Yes,
and we'll
okay.
see if we have some time, Cibele. But basically, you say
No,
it's collaboration and also diversity. So we need to collaborate, but we still need to keep a diversity open.
Yes.
So not a single one-size-fits-all solution,
Exactly.
basically.
Yeah.
Rafa, any reflections on that?
People often think about resilience as this very complex theoretical concept that is really difficult to apply in the ground, but I see it completely different. And I would say the best way of applying resilience to local communities and building up resilience is thinking about the three musketeers of its components. Cibele already talked about the diversity, and that's basic for applying resilience. But I would add that we need to improve the way in which local communities are connected to the system in general. So connectivity is the second musketeer of resilience, and we have very good examples of empirical research that is improving connectivity across different scales. And the second one is feedbacks, which might be the most difficult one to understand, but it's basically the way in which we learn about the environment and the systems around us. So how do we connect, diversify, and how we learn about the biophysical sphere that we are all living in is basic for applying in a more practical way the concept of resilience. And we have with this pandemic a tremendous amount of empirical evidence that suggests that we can change the feedbacks of the system internally and externally as well. So focusing on the three musketeers might be helpful for applying resilience to the ground.
Thanks, Rafa. And now, a few months or 6 months into the pandemic, do you remain optimistic, Rafa?
Yes, I think even though it's a horrendous crisis, and just as Cibele said, different places are facing different challenges regarding the pandemic, I still keep optimistic that this might be a great opportunity to change the way in which we relate to nature. And I would say that changing this personal sphere is the most important lesson that we might be able to learn from this pandemic. And this keeps me optimistic, of course.
And how about you, Cibele? How do you stay optimistic?
I wish I was so optimistic. I'm not sure. I mean, I think I'm a bit of both, right? I think the problem is that we haven't seen yet the full negative effects of the crisis, right? We don't know. We know from resilience research, for instance, that, you know, if you repeatedly are exposed, like constantly exposed to a stress, right, your resilience erodes over time. And this is what can happen here, right? Because we are still in the middle of it. We don't know, you know, when sort of restriction measures will disappear. And sort of if this continue, if we continue to have lockdowns, if we continue to have all these restrictions, the social consequences might, you know, become increasingly worse over time. So that's my big worry. But as Rafa, I also have hope. I mean, I have seen, like we have seen in our work, Albert, I mean, many examples of fantastic new things happening as well. And I think there is always a positive side of a crisis, right? I mean, it can be controversial to say that, but it does exist. Like there is this side of transformation and opportunity for renewal. And exactly as Rafa, I think we are seeing signs of that. So we are seeing new social configurations, a raising up of grassroots movements, and sort of this kind of new ways of reconnecting with nature. And that makes me hopeful. So, yeah.
Well, thank you both very much for an extremely illuminating and interesting conversation. Thanks, Rafa. It's early in the morning in Mexico. Thanks, Cibele, for joining us here in the studio in Stockholm.
Thanks a lot, Albert. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Albert.
You have listened to Rethink Talks, a podcast series produced by the Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University. For more episodes, head over to our website, rethink.earth.